I stayed still as the radio on Officer Collins' shoulder crackled again, but this time the tone shifted, sharper and more urgent than before. His eyes moved away from me for half a second, listening to something I could not hear, and in that half second the balance in the air changed again. Sergeant Davis noticed it too, his posture tightening as he stepped closer to the edge of the pump island. The gas station felt smaller now, like the space itself was folding inward under pressure. Inside the store, the cashier had fully stopped moving, hands hovering above the counter, watching through the glass like the world outside had turned into a scene he did not want to be part of. I kept my hands visible, but my attention was no longer on them. It was on the system behind the station. The pump network, the camera loop, the internal control feed that connected every nozzle, every light, every door lock into one administrative panel. I knew it because I had been inside that panel before, not as a suspect, but as part of maintenance oversight for compliance audits. Officer Collins took another step forward and repeated his instruction, but his voice no longer carried the same certainty. Something had entered the situation that he did not control. A third patrol unit rolled in slowly and stopped at an angle that blocked half the exit lane. That was the second escalation in less than a minute. Sergeant Davis raised his hand slightly, signaling coordination, but I noticed his eyes flick toward the station camera above Pump 3. That camera was not just recording. It was streaming to a centralized server, and that server logged every access attempt. A flicker of light passed through the pump display behind me, and I understood immediately that someone had just pinged the system remotely. Not the officers. Someone inside operations. I exhaled slowly, steadying my voice before speaking. You are responding to a report, but you have not verified the source footage, I said. Officer Collins frowned, irritation breaking through his control. We do not need your instructions, he replied, but his tone lacked force now. Sergeant Davis did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned slightly toward the station entrance, where a young employee in a blue uniform stood frozen near the door frame. I recognized him now as Ethan Walker, night shift attendant. His eyes kept shifting between me and the officers like he was trying to decide whether to speak or disappear. That hesitation told me more than anything else. I turned my head slightly toward him, not asking, just acknowledging. He flinched but then stepped forward one cautious step. Sir, Ethan said quietly to Sergeant Davis, she has been here the entire shift. I saw her check out earlier at Pump 3 logs. That statement changed the atmosphere instantly. It was not dramatic, but it was structural. A new data point entered the system of assumptions. Officer Collins turned sharply toward him. You are sure? He asked. Ethan nodded once, but his hands were shaking slightly. That was the first crack. I watched Sergeant Davis process it in real time. His gaze shifted from me to Collins, then back to the pump display. The confidence that had defined the initial approach was no longer stable. Another flicker appeared in the station lights, and this time it was not random. It followed a pattern. A diagnostic cycle. Someone was running a full system check remotely. I knew what that meant. Internal audit protocol had been triggered, likely from a higher administrative level. The officers did not know that yet, but they felt the shift anyway. Officer Collins lowered his hand from his belt slightly, not fully relaxed, but no longer prepared for immediate escalation. The silence that followed was heavier than before, not because it was empty, but because it was waiting. I finally spoke again, slowly, evenly. If you are going to continue detaining me, you will need confirmation through the station's camera timestamp and pump authorization log. That was the third escalation, not in force, but in structure. Sergeant Davis narrowed his eyes. You have access to that system, he said, not as an accusation, but as a realization. I nodded once. I do. As part of operational oversight. The word shifted something in his expression. Oversight implied authorization, not suspicion. Inside the store, a customer whispered something and stepped away from the window completely. The glass now reflected only flashing lights and distorted silhouettes. Officer Collins looked unsettled for the first time. He spoke into his radio again, but this time there was hesitation in his voice. I could hear fragments of response, but nothing clear. Then the station intercom clicked on unexpectedly, filling the air with a soft automated tone. System verification in progress. Please stand by. That was not supposed to happen during a field response. Sergeant Davis stepped back half a step, scanning the ceiling speakers, then the pump interface, then me. The structure of control was no longer centered on them. It was shifting towards something else entirely. I kept my gaze steady, not challenging, not retreating. Just present. And in that moment, I realized the officers were no longer the only ones trying to understand what was happening at Pump 3. I stood where I was as the automated system voice echoed again through the gas station speakers, but this time the tone was different, more controlled, more deliberate, like the building itself had joined the conversation. The word system verification in progress repeated once, then faded into a low mechanical hum that vibrated through the pump structures under my feet. Officer Collins looked up immediately, his posture tightening as he scanned the ceiling speakers and then the pump interface again. Sergeant Davis stepped closer to him, speaking in a lower voice, but I could see uncertainty forming between them. The station was no longer just a location. It was becoming an active system responding to an internal query, and they were no longer the only ones issuing commands. The digital display on Pump 3 flickered once, then stabilized, showing a brief diagnostic sequence that neither officer had initiated. That was the moment I knew the audit protocol had fully engaged. Ethan Walker was still standing near the store entrance, his face pale, his hands no longer shaking but frozen in place like he was afraid to breathe too loudly. I turned slightly toward him and asked calmly, "Did anyone from law enforcement request system access authorization? Through the station network before arrival?" He hesitated for a second, then shook his head slowly. "No," he said. That answer changed the structure of everything in the room. Officer Collins reacted immediately. "What are you talking about?" he asked sharply, but his voice now carried less control than before. I did not answer him directly. Instead, I looked at the pump display again, where a small line of text had appeared indicating external access attempt logged and denied. That meant someone had tried to interface with the system remotely without proper clearance. Sergeant Davis noticed it at the same time I did. His expression tightened, and for the first time, he stepped back instead of forward. The authority dynamic was shifting in real time, not through confrontation, but through data exposure. Inside the store, the cashier slowly lowered his hands from the counter, watching the display through the glass as if trying to understand whether this was still a police situation or something else entirely. The neon light above the entrance flickered again, synchronized with a second diagnostic pulse running through the fuel system. I could feel the pattern now. Someone inside the central monitoring network had escalated the review level to critical. That meant every action happening at this station was being logged and compared against authorization records in real time. Officer Collins finally spoke again, but his tone had changed. "What system access are you referring to?" he asked. I answered simply, "The station operations grid, including fuel control, surveillance feed, and administrative override permissions." That was enough for Sergeant Davis to turn slightly toward him. I saw it in his face first, not confusion anymore, but concern. Not about me, but about procedure. Because if what I was saying was accurate, then their entire approach had bypassed required verification steps. The radio on Officer Collins' shoulder crackled again, but this time the voice that came through was clearer, more structured. It was not field dispatch. It was internal operations control. A calm voice instructed them to pause all active detainment procedures pending verification of station system integrity. Officer Collins froze for a moment. I watched his grip loosen slightly on his stance, not fully stepping back, but no longer advancing either. Sergeant Davis turned his head slowly toward the pump island, then toward me again. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer pressure. It was reassessment. Ethan finally spoke again, quieter this time, almost unsure of himself. "I can pull the full camera log if needed," he said, looking toward the officers. That was the turning point in perception. Because now there was a second source of confirmation that did not originate from me. Officer Collins exhaled sharply, then looked away for a moment as if recalibrating everything he had assumed in the last few minutes. The station intercom clicked again, but this time no message followed. Only static, then silence. The pump display shifted once more, showing authorization mismatch resolved pending review completion. That meant the system had now confirmed inconsistencies in the initial request that triggered this entire response. Sergeant Davis lowered his hand completely from his radio. He was no longer preparing for escalation. He was waiting for confirmation from a system that no longer aligned with the narrative they arrived with. I remained still, watching the flow of control shift away from physical presence and into verification layers they had not anticipated. The environment had changed without a single physical confrontation. Only information had moved, and that information was now heavier than authority. Officer Collins finally stepped back half a pace, not fully retreating, but no longer asserting dominance over the space. The gas station felt quieter now, but it was not peace. It was recalculation. And I knew this was no longer about whether I would be detained. It was about what the system would confirm next, and who would be held accountable when it finished speaking. I remained in place as the station light settled into a steady pulse, no longer flickering randomly but responding in a measured diagnostic rhythm that echoed through the pump island like a heartbeat I could not ignore. The silence that followed the system confirmation was not empty, it was structured, like every layer of the station had shifted from reaction to evaluation. Officer Collins stood slightly back now, his stance no longer aggressive, his eyes moving between me and the pump display as if trying to decide which reality he was supposed to trust. Sergeant Davis did not speak for several seconds. He was watching the same interface I was watching, the one that had just confirmed authorization mismatch resolved pending review completion. That single line changed everything in their posture, because it meant the system had already begun correcting the assumptions that brought them here. Ethan Walker stayed near the store entrance, frozen but attentive, as if afraid that any sudden movement might interrupt something important. I could feel the weight of every camera angle in the station now, not just recording but actively syncing to a central verification network that was pulling logs in real time. I finally broke the silence, not to challenge them, but to stabilize the structure of what was unfolding. "The system has completed initial integrity checks," I said evenly. Officer Collins turned toward me immediately. "What does that mean exactly?" he asked, and for the first time there was uncertainty in his voice instead of control. I looked at the pump display again as another line of data populated beneath the previous one, showing station access history reconciliation in progress. "It means," I replied, "that every command issued since your arrival is now being cross-referenced with authorized dispatch records and operational permissions." That explanation did not calm him. It shifted his discomfort into something more visible. Sergeant Davis stepped forward slightly again, but not toward me this time, toward the pump interface. His hand hovered near the screen without touching it, as if proximity alone might change the outcome. The radio on Officer Collins' shoulder crackled again, but this time the tone was official, not field coordination. A dispatcher's voice confirmed that no active warrant or verified suspect alert matched the description provided to them for this location. That sentence hung in the air longer than anything else had that night. Officer Collins lowered his chin slightly, processing it in real time. I noticed his breathing change, not fast, not panicked, but recalibrating. The station was no longer reinforcing their original assumption. Instead, it was dismantling it piece by piece through verified records. Ethan finally stepped forward another half step, gaining confidence from the shift. "I told you she checked out earlier," he said again, this time more clearly. Sergeant Davis turned his head toward him slowly. "You are certain of that timestamp?" he asked. Ethan nodded and pointed toward the store terminal. It is logged in the system under Pump 3 maintenance sync. It is still there. That confirmation triggered another layer of system response. The pump display refreshed again, this time showing a full audit trace opening across the screen, listing access attempts, camera alignment records, and fuel authorization logs. I watched the officers read it without needing to explain further. The truth was now being displayed without interpretation. Officer Collins took another step back, this time more noticeable, as if the ground under his assumptions had shifted. "We were responding to an active report," he said, but the sentence no longer carried certainty. Sergeant Davis finally spoke in a lower tone, not directed at me, but at the situation itself. "The report source was not verified through dispatch channel authentication," he said, almost as a realization rather than an instruction. That was the point where authority stopped acting and started evaluating itself. I remained still, watching the system complete its final reconciliation phase. The station intercom activated one more time, but instead of an alert, it delivered a simple confirmation that all active external requests had been suspended pending administrative review. No alarm followed. No escalation. Just closure. Inside the store, the cashier slowly sat back down, as if the tension holding him upright had finally released. Outside, the patrol lights continued flashing, but their rhythm no longer felt dominant. It felt secondary to the system. That had already spoken. Officer Collins finally looked at me directly again, but the edge in his expression was gone. What remained was the awareness that the situation they entered with certainty no longer existed in the same form. Sergeant Davis lowered his hand completely and turned slightly away from the pump, exhaling once through his nose as if acknowledging a conclusion he did not control. The station had finished its verification cycle, and in doing so, it had rewritten the context of every action taken since the moment they arrived. I could feel the shift settle across the entire space, not as resolution, but as reclassification. And I understood that what had just ended was not the confrontation itself, but the version of reality they had brought with them when they stepped into the light of Pump 3. I stayed where I was as the system interface finally settled into a stable state, the earlier fluctuations in the gas station infrastructure fading into a consistent diagnostic pattern that now ran quietly through every connected device. The lights above Pump 3 no longer flickered randomly. They pulsed in a controlled cycle, signaling that the verification process had moved from active interrogation to final validation. Officer Collins stood with his weight shifted slightly back on his heels, no longer advancing, no longer issuing commands with the same certainty as before. Sergeant Davis had stepped half a pace away from the pump interface, his eyes fixed on the updated audit feed as if trying to reconstruct the sequence of decisions that had led here. The space between everyone felt different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because the authority structure that defined the moment had been quietly rewritten by data they could not ignore. Ethan Walker remained near the store entrance, his posture slowly relaxing, though his eyes still darted between the officers and the system display, as if waiting for confirmation that it was safe to believe what he was seeing. I noticed the moment Sergeant Davis finally acknowledged the audit results in full. His expression shifted slightly, not into relief, but into recognition. The system had confirmed no valid active warrant, no verified suspect alert, and no authorized escalation request tied to this location. That single confirmation dissolved the foundation of the entire response. Officer Collins looked down briefly at his radio, then back at the pump display, as if hoping for a secondary instruction that would override what was already finalizing in front of him. But nothing came. Only silence and structured data reconciliation. I broke the silence first, not to assert dominance, but to close the loop of misunderstanding. "The verification cycle has completed," I said calmly. Officer Collins turned his head toward me slowly. His voice, when it came, was lower than before. "Then why was this report initiated?" he asked. I did not answer immediately because the answer was not emotional, it was procedural. Instead, I looked at the station's central log feed still visible on the pump interface. It showed the original alert source as an unverified third-party input routed through an external tip line, not through official dispatch verification channels. Sergeant Davis stepped closer again, reading the same line I was reading. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in realization of procedural breakdown. This was not confirmed through chain verification, he said quietly, almost to himself. That statement marked a second collapse in authority interpretation, because it confirmed that their response had bypassed required authentication layers. Officer Collins finally lowered his hand completely from his belt. The motion was small, but it carried weight, signaling that escalation was no longer active. The environment around us felt quieter now, but it was not peaceful. It was recalibrated. Inside the store, the cashier exhaled slowly and leaned back against the counter, no longer watching as if expecting impact. The customers who had gathered near the glass began to shift away, their attention losing urgency as the situation lost its perceived threat. I could see Ethan finally step fully into the light near the entrance, his shoulders no longer rigid. He looked at Sergeant Davis and spoke again, more confidently this time. "I can print the full timestamp log if needed," he said. Sergeant Davis nodded once, acknowledging the offer, but did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned slightly toward Officer Collins. Their silent exchange carried more meaning than words. It was the recognition that what they had acted on was not supported by verified operational data. The station intercom activated again briefly, but instead of alerts or warnings, it delivered a final system statement confirming audit completion and restoration of normal operational status. No further actions were authorized. That message did not escalate anything. It concluded it. Officer Collins stepped back another half step, then stopped. His eyes lingered on the pump display for a moment longer, as if trying to reconcile the difference between what he had responded to and what the system had confirmed. Sergeant Davis finally lowered his gaze entirely, breaking visual engagement with the interface. The authority they arrived with had not been challenged through confrontation. It had been dissolved through verification. I remained still, watching the final lines of the audit log stabilize across the screen, marking every action taken since their arrival as reviewed and reconciled. There was no longer a sense of opposition in the space, only adjustment. Officer Collins finally spoke again, but this time his voice carried no directive. "We will document this as a system verification incident," he said. Sergeant Davis nodded in agreement. It was not a resolution in the traditional sense, but it was closure within their framework. As they began to step back toward their vehicles, the station lights returned fully to normal brightness, no longer pulsing with diagnostic patterns. The pump interface locked into standard mode, confirming that control had returned to routine operation. Ethan exhaled quietly behind me, as if only now realizing he had been holding his breath the entire time. I stayed in place for a moment longer, watching the cruisers reposition without urgency, their presence no longer centered on enforcement, but on departure. The system had already spoken its final confirmation, and everything that followed was no longer escalation, only aftermath. And as the last of the flashing lights began to move away from the gas station, I understood that what had changed here was not just the outcome of a single misunderstanding, but the way truth had been verified before authority could act on it. I stayed in position long after the last patrol car turned away from the gas station, its red and blue lights shrinking into the distance until they were nothing more than faint reflections on wet asphalt. The silence that followed was not empty anymore. It felt structured, like the station itself was slowly returning to a baseline state after stress testing every system it had. Pump 3 displayed a steady operational screen again, no longer cycling through audit diagnostics, just normal fuel data and idle status. The overhead neon sign stabilized its flicker, settling into a constant glow that painted the concrete in soft white and blue tones. Inside the store, movement resumed carefully at first, like people were testing whether the moment of tension had truly ended or was simply paused. Ethan Walker stepped fully out from the doorway now, his shoulders lowering as he looked toward me, then toward the pump system, as if confirming reality through repetition. Officer Collins and Sergeant Davis were no longer in the immediate space, but their presence lingered in the form of tire marks and fading engine noise on the road beyond the lot. I turned slightly toward the station entrance, where the cashier had finally resumed normal posture, reorganizing items behind the counter with slow, cautious movements. No one spoke for several seconds. It was the kind of silence that comes after a system finishes correcting itself, when everyone involved is still processing the difference between assumption and confirmation. Ethan finally broke that silence. "So it is over," he said, not as a question, but as an attempt to understand the finality of it. I looked at him briefly, then back at the pump interface, which now showed a standard operational summary with all temporary flags cleared. "The verification cycle is complete," I said calmly. That phrase now carried a different weight than it had earlier. It no longer referred to escalation. It referred to resolution. Ethan nodded slowly, then stepped closer to the pump island, glancing at the control panel beneath Pump 3. "I have never seen the system run a full audit like that in real time," he said. I did not respond immediately because he was right. It was not common. The station network was designed for isolated diagnostics, not live integrated authority reconciliation during field incidents. Yet tonight it had escalated beyond standard procedure because external input had bypassed verification layers. I moved slightly toward the control panel, my attention shifting to the final log entries still visible on the internal display. They showed every access attempt, every request for validation, and every denial issued during the sequence. It was all documented, timestamped, and locked into the administrative record. That meant no subjective interpretation would override what had already been recorded. Ethan followed my gaze. "Does this happen often?" he asked quietly. I shook my head once. "Only when external enforcement acts without confirmed dispatch authorization," I replied. He absorbed that without speaking. Inside the store, the cashier placed a new cup under the coffee machine, but his movements were slower than before, as if his body had not fully caught up with the fact that danger perception had already been removed. A few customers who had gathered earlier were now leaving, pushing the glass door open carefully, stepping back into the night as if trying not to disturb the recalibrated atmosphere. I noticed Ethan still watching me, his expression shifting from confusion to curiosity. "You knew the system would respond like that," he said. I looked at him briefly. "I knew the system would correct inconsistencies," I replied. "It is designed to protect operational integrity, not assumptions." He nodded again, processing the distinction slowly. The wind outside moved lightly across the gas station canopy, carrying faint echoes of distant traffic, but nothing from the earlier confrontation remained except traces in the tire tracks and the memory of flashing lights fading from view. I stepped closer to the pump. Interface one final time, confirming that all audit processes had fully closed. The screen showed normal status, no active alerts, no pending verification flags. Everything had returned to baseline. Ethan leaned against the edge of the pump island, exhaling as if he had been holding tension in his entire body without realizing it. "I thought they were going to keep escalating it," he said honestly. I understood what he meant. That expectation had been present in the way everyone reacted when the officers first arrived. But escalation had never been the final outcome the system was designed for. Verification was. I turned slightly away from the pump and looked across the station lot. The space felt different now, not because anything physical had changed, but because the authority structure that once filled it had been removed through validation instead of conflict. Ethan followed my gaze. "So what happens next?" he asked. I paused for a moment before answering, because the answer was not about the station anymore. It was about process continuity. "Nothing resets," I said. "It just returns to standard operation." He nodded slowly, as if that idea itself was unfamiliar. Inside the store, the cashier placed a final item on the shelf and stepped back, finally returning to routine. The neon light above Pump 3 held steady, uninterrupted, reflecting off the wet pavement in a calm, even glow. The system had completed its function, and the space was no longer under interpretation. It was under confirmation. And as I stood there with the night settling fully back into normal rhythm, I understood that the real shift had not been the arrival of authority, but the moment truth had been required to verify it before anything else could proceed. I stood at pump 3 as the gas station slowly settled back into its normal rhythm, the earlier tension dissolving into the steady hum of fluorescent lights and distant highway noise. The system interface in front of me showed a final state confirmation: all audit processes closed, all external verification threads resolved. Nothing on the screen indicated threat, alert, or pending escalation. It was as if the entire incident had been absorbed and categorized into a completed record, stored somewhere beyond immediate perception. Ethan remained nearby, leaning lightly against the pump structure, still watching the display as if expecting it to change again. The cashier inside the store had resumed normal activity completely now, moving between shelves and counter with measured, controlled motions that no longer carried hesitation. The sense of collective stillness that had defined the earlier confrontation was gone, replaced by a quiet that felt almost procedural. I glanced once toward the road where the patrol vehicles had disappeared minutes earlier. No sirens remained, no flashing lights, only the faint memory of movement fading into distance. Ethan broke the silence first, his voice softer than before. "So that is really it," he said, more as reflection than question. I nodded slightly, keeping my attention on the system logs. "The incident has been fully reconciled within operational records," I replied. That statement now felt final in a way that no physical action had needed to reinforce. Ethan looked down briefly, then back at the pump. "I did not think it would end like that," he admitted. I understood what he meant. Situations like this usually escalated, carried forward by assumption rather than correction. But this time, the structure had intervened before interpretation could harden into consequence. I stepped slightly closer to the interface panel, confirming once again that all access logs had been sealed. The screen showed a final summary line indicating integrity restored and no discrepancies remaining. That phrase carried more weight than it should have. It meant every action taken by every party had been measured against authorization and corrected where necessary. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, crossing his arms as he looked out across the empty forecourt. "I have worked here for 2 years, he said slowly, "and I have never seen anything like that system response." I glanced at him briefly. "It only activates when conflicting authority inputs are detected," I said. He frowned slightly at that, trying to process it. "Conflicting authority inputs," he repeated quietly. I nodded once. When external enforcement does not align with verified dispatch authorization, the system prioritizes data integrity over assumption. He exhaled, as if the explanation made sense but still felt distant from lived experience. Behind him, the convenience store door opened briefly as a customer stepped out, paused, then continued walking into the parking lot without looking back. Life was resuming in fragments, careful and uneven, as if the environment itself was still remembering how to be normal. I looked again at pump 3. The nozzle was back in place, the digital display stable, the fuel line inactive and secure. Everything was functioning within expected parameters. But beneath that normality was something more precise now, a recorded truth that no longer depended on perception. Ethan pushed off the pump slightly, standing upright again. "So what happens with all of this now?" he asked. I took a moment before answering because the answer was not about action anymore, but about outcome classification. "It remains in the system archive," I said. "Fully verified and no longer active." He nodded slowly, absorbing that idea. The concept of something so intense becoming inactive through verification rather than resolution seemed to settle differently in his mind. I turned slightly away from pump 3 and looked across the station lot. The space felt unchanged physically, but structurally it had been rewritten in record. Every decision, every response, every delay had been captured and evaluated without exception. Ethan followed my gaze. "Do people usually get that kind of review when something like this happens?" he asked. I shook my head once. "Only when there is uncertainty between reported information and confirmed system data," I replied. He looked back toward the store, then toward the empty road where the patrol cars had left. It felt like everything shifted in real time, he said. I understood that observation. It had shifted, not through force, but through verification layers that activated faster than human interpretation. The wind moved lightly across the open forecourt, carrying the faint scent of fuel and wet pavement. The neon sign above the station buzzed softly, steady and unchanged now. I checked the final system status one more time. No pending alerts. No unresolved flags. No active investigations. Just closure. Ethan stood quietly beside me now, no longer tense, but still processing the sequence of events that had unfolded in front of him. I guess I will remember this for a long time, he said finally. I did not respond immediately because I knew he was right. Not because of what had happened physically, but because of how quickly perception had been overwritten by verified structure. I stepped back slightly from the pump interface and looked once more across the station. The night was still again, not in the way it had been before, but in a way that felt officially restored. And as I stood there with the system fully returned to normal operation, I understood that what had truly changed was not the event itself, but the certainty of how events must now be confirmed before they are allowed to become consequence. I remained at Pump 3 as the night air grew calmer, the gas station now operating in a fully restored state where every system indicator had returned to its default pattern. The earlier tension was no longer present in physical form, yet it still lingered in the way Ethan stood beside the pump, watching the interface as if expecting another shift. The digital display showed no anomalies, no active alerts, and no remaining verification flags. Everything had been cleared through the final audit reconciliation process, leaving only a structured record of what had occurred. Inside the store, the cashier moved more naturally now, restocking items and interacting with the register without hesitation, as if the entire previous hour had been compressed into something distant and procedural. I looked once more across the forecourt where the patrol vehicles had been earlier. The absence of their presence felt more significant than their arrival, as if the space itself was adjusting to a corrected version of events. Ethan finally broke the silence again, his voice slower and more thoughtful than before. So the system just decides what is real based on the data it verifies, he said. I turned slightly toward him. It does not decide reality, I replied. It verifies consistency between reported events and recorded system input. He nodded, but his expression showed he was still processing the difference. I understood why. From his perspective, what had just happened looked like authority being overwritten by infrastructure. From mine, it was simply procedural alignment between conflicting inputs. I stepped closer to the pump interface, where the final log summary remained visible. It showed a complete timeline of system interactions, from the initial external report request to the final closure of all active verification threads. Every entry was timestamped, every action traced to its source. Ethan leaned slightly forward to look at it. That is a lot of information for one incident, he said. I nodded once. It is standard when multiple authorization sources conflict during live field response conditions, I explained. He exhaled slowly, looking out across the station again. The wind had picked up slightly, moving across the open lot and causing the neon signage above the store to hum faintly. The environment felt stable now, but not static. It was in a state of post-verification equilibrium, where all systems had returned to baseline but retained memory of the correction that had just occurred. I noticed Ethan glancing back at me again, this time with a different kind of curiosity. Do you always have access to systems like that? He asked. I paused briefly before responding. Access is conditional based on operational oversight authorization, I said. That answer did not fully satisfy his curiosity, but it gave him enough structure to understand that what had happened was not random intervention, but controlled verification response. Inside the store, a customer placed items on the counter and paid without looking outside, as if the external world had separated itself from the normal rhythm of transactions. The cashier scanned each item with steady hands, no longer distracted by the earlier disruption. I stepped slightly away from Pump 3, allowing the interface to remain in standby mode. The screen dimmed slightly, indicating system stability had been maintained for a continuous period beyond active audit closure. Ethan followed my movement with his eyes. It felt like everything changed the moment that system started running checks, he said. I nodded once. That is because the system does not react to perception, I said. It reacts to input validation. He looked down at the ground for a moment, then back up toward the station lights. So if the input is wrong, everything built on it just collapses, he said slowly. I considered that statement before replying. It is not collapse, I said. It is correction. The distinction mattered more than the outcome itself. The station had not broken down. It had realigned. Ethan crossed his arms lightly, absorbing that idea. The night around us continued to settle into its natural rhythm, distant traffic moving along the highway, occasional light reflections passing across the wet pavement. Nothing about the environment suggested conflict anymore, yet the memory of structure shifting remained embedded in the way silence now felt measured instead of accidental. I glanced once more at the pump system logs before closing the interface. The final confirmation message displayed system integrity restored with no outstanding discrepancies. That was the official end state. Ethan pushed himself off the pump slowly, standing more upright now. I guess people do not usually see what happens behind that kind of verification process, he said. I shook my head once. They do not, I replied. He nodded, accepting that without further question. The station had fully transitioned back into routine operation, but something about the space felt permanently marked by what had occurred, not through damage or disruption, but through documented correction. I stepped back toward the center of the forecourt, taking one final look at Pump 3 and the surrounding area. Everything was functioning normally again, yet the sequence of events that had just concluded remained recorded in layers beneath that normality. Ethan stood quietly beside me, no longer tense, but still reflective. The night no longer carried uncertainty. It carried confirmation. And as I stood there watching the station return fully to its baseline state, I understood that what had unfolded was not about control being taken or lost, but about how quickly assumptions are replaced when systems are required to verify them before anything else can continue. I stayed at Pump 3 as the gas station fully stabilized into its normal operational rhythm, the earlier verification sequence now completely closed and stored within the system logs. The interface in front of me displayed only standard fuel data and routine maintenance status, as if the entire incident had already been categorized and archived beyond active attention. Ethan remained nearby, no longer tense, but still quietly processing everything that had unfolded. He stood with his hands in his pockets, occasionally looking at the pump display and then toward the empty lot where the patrol vehicles had disappeared minutes earlier. The space around us no longer carried urgency, but it still carried weight, like a memory embedded into the structure of the environment itself. I glanced once more at the system terminal before stepping slightly away from it, confirming again that all verification threads had been fully resolved. There were no remaining alerts, no pending authorization conflicts, and no active system overrides. Everything had returned to baseline operation. Ethan broke the silence slowly, his voice more reflective than before. I keep thinking about how fast everything changed once that system started running checks, he said. I turned slightly toward him. It did not change, I replied. It corrected inconsistencies that were already present. He nodded, but I could see that distinction was still settling in his understanding. For him, it had felt like a sudden shift in reality. For the system, it had been a structured alignment process triggered by conflicting inputs. Inside the store, movement continued normally now, with customers paying for items and the cashier operating the register without hesitation. The neon lighting above the entrance remained steady, casting a consistent glow across the parking lot. The wind had softened, and the distant highway noise had returned as the dominant background sound, replacing the earlier tension that had filled the space. Ethan stepped slightly closer to Pump 3, looking at the inactive diagnostic panel. So all of that was just the system checking if what they believed was actually correct, he said. I nodded once. It verifies reported information against recorded operational data, I said. If there is no alignment, it pauses interpretation until validation is complete. He looked down briefly, then back up at the station. That is a very different way of handling things compared to how people usually react, he said. I understood what he meant. Human response tends to escalate based on perception. System response waits for confirmation before allowing escalation to proceed. I moved slightly across the forecourt, scanning the area once more. The tire marks from earlier were still visible near the entrance, faint but present, marking where the patrol vehicles had stopped and turned. Everything else, however, had returned to routine function. Ethan followed my movement with his eyes. Do you think they will treat situations differently after this? He asked. I paused briefly before answering. They will adjust based on documentation and review outcomes, I said. That was the most accurate way to describe what would happen next. Not emotional change, but procedural adjustment. Inside the store, the cashier closed the register drawer and returned to restocking shelves, moving with steady, unbroken rhythm. The station had fully re-entered its normal state, but I could still feel the residual structure of the verification process embedded in how everything now felt measured rather than reactive. Ethan leaned lightly against the pump structure again, exhaling slowly. It felt like everything was certain for a moment, then suddenly it was not, he said. I looked toward the pump interface one final time. It was never certainty, I replied. It was assumption awaiting verification. He nodded slowly, absorbing that idea without further argument. The night had settled completely now, with no remaining signals of escalation. The station lights remained steady, the pump systems idle, and the surrounding environment fully restored to routine operation. I stepped back slightly, taking in the entire forecourt one last time. Everything appeared unchanged, yet the sequence of events that had just concluded remained embedded within the system records as a fully resolved verification incident. Ethan stood beside me quietly now, no longer analyzing, just observing the return to normalcy. The contrast between what had happened and what now remained was no longer active in motion, but it was still present in understanding. And as I stood there with the station fully stabilized and the system completely at rest, I recognized that the true outcome was not what had been stopped or escalated, but how quickly reality had been required to prove itself before anyone could continue acting upon it. I remained at Pump 3 as the gas station continued in full operational stability, the system interface now showing only routine status indicators and no trace of the earlier verification cycle. The night had settled into a quiet, controlled rhythm where every sound felt distant and evenly distributed across the open forecourt. Ethan stood a few feet away from me, still near the pump structure, his posture relaxed but his attention not fully detached from what had happened. There was a lingering awareness in the way he looked at the station, as if expecting the environment to briefly reveal something hidden beneath its normal appearance. I checked the interface one more time out of habit. Everything remained in standard mode, fuel system idle, surveillance feed active, no alerts, no conflicts, no pending reviews. It was as if the entire event had already been absorbed into a completed operational record. Ethan finally spoke after a long pause, his voice steady but reflective. It is strange how something can feel so intense and then just stop, he said. I turned slightly toward him. It did not stop abruptly, I replied. It transitioned from active verification to resolved state. He nodded slowly, but I could see he was still interpreting the difference between experience and system logic. Inside the store, the cashier moved with full normality now, scanning items, closing transactions, and reorganizing shelves. Without any visible hesitation. The earlier presence of law enforcement had left no physical trace beyond faint tire marks near the entrance and a slight disturbance in the gravel where vehicles had turned. The neon lighting above the station continued its steady glow, reflecting softly off the pavement, giving the entire area a calm, almost unchanged appearance. Ethan pushed himself off the pump structure slightly and looked out across the lot. I keep thinking about how quickly everyone changed what they believed was happening, he said. I understood what he meant. Perception had shifted faster than confirmation, and action had followed perception before validation could intervene. That sequence was what had created the tension, not the system itself. I stepped a little closer to the edge of the forecourt, scanning the perimeter out of routine awareness. The road beyond was quiet now, with no flashing lights, no movement indicating continued enforcement presence. Everything had returned to baseline conditions. Ethan followed my gaze and then looked back at me. "Do you think they will report it as a mistake?" he asked. I paused briefly before responding. "They will report it based on verified system output," I said. That meant the classification would depend entirely on the audit logs, not personal interpretation. Ethan considered that quietly, then nodded. "So it becomes whatever the system says it was," he said. I answered simply. "It becomes what is documented and confirmed." He exhaled slowly, turning his attention back toward Pump 3. The display remained unchanged, showing standard operational data with no indication that anything unusual had occurred within the last hour. That contrast between what had been experienced and what was now recorded was what defined the entire incident. I looked once more at the interface, confirming again that all verification threads were fully closed. There were no active flags, no pending reconciliation requests, and no external system links remaining open. Everything had returned to standard operational flow. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, his tone quieter now. "It feels like the system had more control over the situation than any of the people did," he said. I considered that observation. "It did not take control," I replied. "It enforced consistency when inputs were conflicting." He nodded, but did not immediately respond. The station lights hummed softly above us, steady and unchanged, while the distant sound of passing vehicles on the highway returned to being the only background motion. Inside the store, the final customer of the moment exited, the door closing gently behind them, leaving only the cashier and the steady rhythm of normal work. I stepped back slightly from the pump interface, allowing the system to remain in idle state. Ethan remained beside me, now no longer analyzing, but simply present in the aftermath of the event. The difference between earlier tension and current stillness was not physical, but structural, as if the environment had reclassified itself after resolving conflicting interpretations. I took one final look across the station. Everything was functioning as expected, every system stable, every process returned to baseline behavior. And as I stood there with Ethan beside me in the quiet stability of the gas station night, I understood that what had just concluded was not simply an incident that ended, but a sequence where every assumption had been required to pass verification before reality itself was allowed to continue. I stayed near Pump 3 as the gas station remained in full operational normality, the system interface now completely stable with no active alerts or verification processes running. The night had settled into a steady rhythm again, with distant highway traffic moving at a consistent flow and the soft hum of fluorescent lighting filling the space above the forecourt. Ethan stood beside the pump structure, no longer tense, but still quietly focused on the environment around him, as if he was checking whether anything else might unexpectedly shift again. The store behind us continued its normal activity, the cashier moving with steady routine and the last few customers finishing their purchases without urgency. Everything looked ordinary now, yet the memory of the earlier system verification still felt present in the structure of how the space was being observed. I glanced at the pump interface once more. All system modules were in idle state, surveillance feed active, fuel control stable, and no pending audit entries remaining. Ethan broke the silence slowly, his voice lower than before, almost reflective. "I keep thinking about how quickly everything became uncertain, then just as quickly became certain again," he said. I turned slightly toward him. "The system does not create uncertainty," I replied. "It identifies when inputs do not align and waits until they are resolved." He nodded, but his expression showed he was still trying to translate that into human terms. Inside the store, the cashier locked the register drawer and stepped back for a moment, glancing toward the forecourt as if confirming that the earlier tension had fully passed. The neon light above the entrance remained steady, casting a consistent reflection across the pavement, now slightly damp from earlier weather. I took a small step away from pump 3, allowing the system display to remain in passive mode. Ethan followed my movement with his eyes. So when everything was happening earlier, it was never actually out of control, he said. I considered the question before responding. It was always within control parameters, I said. The issue was conflicting interpretation of those parameters. He exhaled slowly, looking out toward the road again. The absence of patrol vehicles made the space feel open, but also slightly unfamiliar compared to the intensity of what had occurred before. I noticed that Ethan was no longer watching the system display. He was now watching the space itself, as if trying to understand how something so structured could also feel so unstable in perception. I have worked here for a long time, he said quietly, and I have never seen that level of system intervention before. I nodded once. It is not standard operation, I replied. It only activates when external authority inputs conflict with verified system records. He looked back at me then. So if they had checked the system first, none of this would have happened, he said. I answered simply. Correct verification would have prevented escalation. The words settled between us without reaction. Inside the store, the final customer of the night left, and the door closed with a soft mechanical click. The cashier turned off one section of lighting, leaving the interior slightly dimmer but still visible. The station now felt fully returned to its normal state, but the awareness of what had occurred earlier remained embedded in how everything was being perceived. Ethan leaned lightly against the pump again, this time not out of tension, but out of habit. It is strange to think that something like that depends entirely on whether information matches or not, he said. I understood what he meant. In human terms, it felt like judgment. In system terms, it was reconciliation. I looked across the forecourt one more time, confirming that no residual alerts or diagnostic cycles were still active. Everything remained stable. Ethan followed my gaze and then spoke again, softer now. Do you think people usually understand what actually happened when situations like this end? I paused briefly. They understand what is documented, I replied. Not always what is experienced. He nodded slowly at that, accepting it without further challenge. The wind moved lightly across the open lot again, carrying faint sounds from the highway beyond the station. The neon lights continued their steady glow, and Pump 3 remained fully idle, unchanged from normal conditions. I stepped slightly back, allowing the space to settle into complete operational calm. Ethan remained beside me, no longer analyzing, just present in the aftermath of everything that had unfolded. The contrast between earlier escalation and current stability was no longer active, but it was still present in memory, like a recorded layer beneath the surface of normality. And as I stood there in the restored quiet of the gas station, I understood that the true outcome was not that the situation had been resolved, but that every assumption involved had been required to pass through verification before reality itself was allowed to continue forward. I stayed at Pump 3 as the gas station fully maintained its restored operational state, the system interface now completely calm with no active diagnostics, no alerts, and no trace of the earlier verification cycle still running. The night had deepened slightly, with the sky above the canopy turning a darker shade of blue, while the station lights continued their steady, controlled glow across the pavement. Ethan remained beside the pump structure, quieter now, no longer reacting to the environment but instead observing it with a more settled awareness. The cashier inside the store moved with full routine efficiency, no longer glancing outside, fully absorbed in closing procedures and resetting the register for the next cycle. Everything appeared normal again, but the structure of how normality had been restored still lingered in the way the space felt measured rather than casual. I looked at the pump interface once more. All system logs showed final confirmation status, with audit reconciliation complete and no unresolved entries. Ethan finally spoke after a long pause, his tone thoughtful rather than analytical. It feels like everything that happened earlier is already becoming something distant, he said. I turned slightly toward him. That is how system resolution functions, I replied. Once verification is complete, the event is no longer active, only recorded. He nodded slowly, absorbing that idea without immediately responding. Inside the store, the cashier turned off the last section of interior lighting, leaving only the front counter illuminated, creating a softer contrast against the dark exterior. The neon sign above the entrance continued to hum steadily, its reflection stretching across the wet asphalt in faint lines of light. I stepped slightly away from pump 3, allowing the interface to remain in passive monitoring mode. Ethan followed my movement with his eyes. "I still cannot understand how it changed so quickly from confusion to complete clarity," he said. I responded evenly. "It did not change quickly," I said. "It processed conflicting inputs until one consistent record remained." He looked down at the ground for a moment, then back toward the pump. "So everything that looked like control earlier was actually just the system correcting." "Mismatched information," he said. I nodded once. "Yes," I said. The simplicity of that answer did not reduce the complexity of what had occurred, but it reframed it into structure rather than perception. The forecourt was now almost completely still, with only occasional movement from distant traffic visible beyond the station boundary. Ethan leaned slightly against the pump again, this time not with tension, but with reflection. "I think I understand it better now," he said quietly. It was never about people being right or wrong in the moment. It was about whether the system could confirm what was actually true. I considered that interpretation briefly. "That is a reasonable conclusion," I replied. Inside the store, the cashier locked the final drawer and stepped back from the counter, looking briefly toward the forecourt before turning off the remaining interior lights. The station now existed in full nighttime equilibrium, with only exterior lighting maintaining visibility. I scanned the system interface one final time. No active processes, no pending verifications, no unresolved discrepancies. Everything had returned to standard operational baseline. Ethan stood upright now, no longer leaning, his attention shifting between the empty road and the pump structure. "Do situations like this usually get recorded for review later?" he asked. I answered without hesitation. "All system verification events are logged for administrative review and procedural analysis." He nodded slowly, accepting that without further questions. The wind moved lightly across the station again, carrying faint echoes from the highway, while the neon lights above maintained their steady rhythm without fluctuation. I stepped back slightly from the pump, allowing the system to remain in full idle mode. Ethan remained beside me, no longer trying to interpret every detail, but simply acknowledging the stillness that had replaced the earlier disruption. The difference between what had happened and what now remained was no longer active tension, but structured memory embedded within system records. And as I stood there in the quiet stability of the gas station night, I understood that what had truly defined the entire sequence was not the presence of conflict, but the moment every assumption was required to pass through verification before anything could continue as reality. I remained at pump 3 as the gas station settled into complete operational stillness, the system interface now fully closed to active processes and displaying only standard idle status indicators. The night had reached a deeper phase, with the sky above the canopy now almost completely dark, broken only by the steady artificial glow of the station lighting. Ethan stood beside the pump structure, no longer focused on the technical systems, but instead looking across the forecourt as if trying to understand what remained after everything had been resolved. Inside the store, the final signs of activity were fading, with the cashier completing closing procedures and switching off the remaining interior displays. The environment felt fully returned to normal operation, yet the awareness of what had occurred earlier still existed beneath that surface calm. I glanced once more at Pump 3's interface. All system logs were finalized, audit reconciliation complete, and no pending verification entries remained. Ethan finally spoke after a long pause, his voice steady but reflective. "It feels like the entire situation has already been absorbed into something that does not matter anymore," he said. I turned slightly toward him. "It has been classified as a completed verification event," I replied. "That means it is no longer active in system response, only in record storage." He nodded slowly, processing the idea in silence. The distinction between active experience and archived data was still settling in his understanding. Inside the store, the cashier locked the front register and moved toward the back room, leaving only the exterior lights active. The neon sign above the station continued to glow steadily, casting soft reflections across the pavement that had grown darker as the night progressed. I stepped slightly away from pump 3, allowing the system to remain in full idle state. Ethan followed my movement with his eyes, then looked back toward the road beyond the station. So nothing is actually continuing from what happened earlier, he said. I considered his wording briefly. Correct, I replied. All processes associated with the event have been terminated and logged. He exhaled slowly, as if releasing the last remaining tension he had been carrying since the beginning of the incident. The station was now fully quiet in function, with only environmental sounds present. Distant traffic moved along the highway, faint and steady, while occasional wind passed through the open forecourt. I looked again at the system interface to confirm final status. No alerts, no active connections, no unresolved entries. Everything had been fully resolved and sealed within operational records. Ethan leaned lightly against the pump structure once more, but this time there was no anticipation in his posture. It is strange to think how quickly everything shifted from uncertainty to this, he said quietly. I responded without hesitation. It did not shift, I said. It was continuously evaluated until consistency was achieved. He nodded again, this time without further questions. Inside the store, all remaining lights were now off except for a single safety light near the exit, creating a faint glow that outlined the empty interior. The station had entered its lowest activity state, where only essential systems remained powered. I stepped back slightly from the pump interface, allowing it to remain in passive monitoring mode. Ethan stood beside me, no longer interpreting or analyzing, but simply observing the stillness that had replaced the earlier disruption. The contrast between what had occurred and what now remained was no longer present as tension, but as structure embedded in memory. The forecourt was quiet, the system stable, and all processes complete. I took one final look across the station, confirming that every operational layer had returned to baseline. And as I stood there in the calm of the restored night, I understood that the entire sequence had not been about confrontation or escalation, but about how reality itself must always pass through verification before it is allowed to continue unchanged.